Good evening. It is my great pleasure as the editor of Journal of the European Economic Association to welcome you to this, the 12th lecture in the series of JEEA FBBVA lectures. This series of lectures is made possible by the generosity of the Fundación BBVA, and of course we at JEEA are very grateful to have this opportunity for having these joint seminars. Over the years, this seminar series has become a successful entry in the yearly calendar of major economic lectures. Each year, the lecture is first delivered at the ASSA Meetings in January in the United States and then in May at the Foundation headquarters here in Madrid. The lecture is published as a lead article in the journal during the course of the following year. Consistent with the aims of the journal, the lectures are given in all fields of economics by leading scholars. The lecture series got to a very good start in 2005 when the first lecture was delivered by Jean Tirole, who then later went on to collect his Nobel Prize. And as I hear, he is in Madrid giving a talk at another venue at the moment. So let me say a few words about the partner to this lecture series, the Journal of the European Economic Association. The journal was founded 15 years ago with the aim of becoming one of the major journals in economics. My own belief is that we have established this goal at the moment. By objective measures like the impact factor, we are right there with our top American competitors with Review of Economic Studies, the other recognized top economics journals. The editorial process that we have is very efficient. We have increasing numbers of submissions, so things look good for the journal. So let me take this opportunity to remind all the academics in the audience of what a wonderful place the journal is to send your best work. And then on to introducing tonight's speaker. Tim Besley is a school professor of economics and political science at London School of Economics, where he has been since 1995. He received his PhD from Oxford and started his career as an assistant professor at Princeton University. Tim's research spans all areas of public economics, including development economics and political economy. He's a world leader on numerous issues, including the political economy of public goods, political economy of development and conflicts, and incentive systems in the public sector. He has been recognized for his high-impact work on numerous occasions. Let me give some highlights. Tim is one of the recipients of the EEA Yrjö Jansson Foundation Prize for the Best European Economist under 45 years of age, jointly with Jordi Galli in 2005. Tim is a fellow of Econometric Society, he's a fellow of European Economic Association, and he's a fellow of the British Academy. He's currently the president of International Economic Association, and he will become the president of Econometric Society in 2018. He has delivered important named lectures. Again, I can only give some selections from the long list because of time constraints. He has delivered Valra Bowley lecture, Richard T. Ely lecture, and Schumpeter lecture. He has published numerous papers in all the best journals in economics, and I'm particularly happy to say that he has published numerous papers in Journal of the European Economic Association, starting with our first volume. So, it is a tremendous pleasure to introduce Tim Besley, who will be talking today about preferences and values as cultural capital, theory and policy implications. So, Tim, you have 60 minutes. After that, we'll have some questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Juuso, for that very nice introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be here. In fact, the last time I was here, I was on the jury for the Frontiers of Knowledge Award of the FBBVA, and on that occasion it was Jean Tirole, my competitor tonight, who was presented or given the first award. So I'm going to talk tonight about a title that may give relatively little away, but I'm going to trespass, as I have on occasions, into other areas of beyond economics, but firmly rooted in things which I have been studying over nearly 25 years now, particularly the field of political economy. And in a moment, I'll give you an introduction to exactly what it is I want to accomplish. Let me say there's sort of two parts to what I'm going to talk about in a way. I'm going to talk at quite general levels about some ideas, some things that I think economists should pay more attention to than they perhaps have in the past. But also, I'm going to try and present a little bit of kind of concrete modeling that shows how some ideas, which I don't think have been in economics very much, can be brought in. So let me begin with quite a broad question. I guess given what I've done through the last 25 years of my career, it's an important thing to ask, because in some ways it says, have I been wasting my time for 25 years? Since about that amount of time ago, I decided, and along with a number of others, that we needed to reconnect economics with political science, and was born what is sometimes called the new political economy, political economics, whatever particular title you like to give it. And it came from a realization that it's pretty important for economists not to just talk about the kinds of policies that we think should happen from an economic point of view, but it's also important for economists to spend time understanding, perhaps better than we used to, how policy actually comes about, how it's determined. And there are a number of reasons to want to study the determination of policy as economists. One is to think about how there are distortions or biases in the policy process that prevent the kinds of things that economists think are a good idea happening. Now, of course, that could mean that we just have the wrong view of the world, and that's why the things we think are good are not happening. Or it could be that we can identify reasons in the way the structures of politics work that explain why the things that we as economists think are good ideas do not happen. So I view very much the motivation for studying political economy is we want to make policy making work better. And the key thing is to understand then what are the constraints on policy. And there are some very obvious constraints on policy. One is what people want. That affects policy in a number of ways, and I'll just leave that hanging because it's going to be in the main what I'm talking about during the lecture. But the technologies that we have available to governments to make things happen are clearly a constraint. Now, of course, over time they can change, but they're a constraint on what governments can do. Information. Do we have the information we need to make policies work the way they want? Do we have institutions that facilitate the kinds of policies we want? What about the way the decision-making processes work? What are the rules of the game in which policy is formed? Are they are a kind of constraint on what can be achieved. And then finally, it's how people behave. If you're going to have a policy that, for example, reduces carbon emissions, and you want people to engage in use energy-saving technologies or use other kinds of technologies, we need to understand how people behave. Now, all or any of the above can be made endogenous, to use the economic term, can be made to be things that change over time. But one thing that economists have been relatively reluctant to do is to vary or think about ways in which tastes or preferences or values change. In other words, we typically begin an analysis of policy by assuming there's a fixed set of preferences out there that people have, and then we allow things to change. We allow wealth levels to change, we allow technology to change, we allow all manner of things to change, but we do it in a context of fixed preferences. And I'm going to argue this evening that that's a very restrictive model for a range of policy issues, and it's about time into the field of political economy we paid more attention to the dynamics of preferences and values. Now, this is a somewhat controversial topic even within economics. And there are economists, so Gary Becker and George Stigler had a famous paper on this that argued that it was absolutely essential for economists to take as fixed preferences. And then we could do whatever we wanted, but we had a kind of starting point should be to say, people want what they want. Let's take that as given, and then let's not question where that comes from. But then there are others, and in particular, I'm going to single out Sam Bowles and Herbert Gintis, who've spent their whole careers arguing that actually preference change is fundamental and central to what economics should be studying. And in fact, they have a very famous book called Schooling in Capitalist America, which was all about how schooling was designed as a method of social control, essentially to make people want certain things. And we should think entirely about the schooling system, much less through the traditional lens of economics, which is teaching skills, but really about teaching people values and preferences. And so that's always been central to their particular perspective. And I think now they're moving much more close to the mainstream, and certainly much closer to what we're talking about tonight. Even when people have looked at the dynamics of preferences and values, they've tended to do it in a very individualistic way, just thinking of individuals apart from social interaction. But if you think about it, when we are influenced in ways that may ultimately change our values, it's often because of the interactions we have with others. And there are a few people, and I again singled out a couple of contributions here that I've been particularly influenced by, as approaches to thinking about how our social interactions with others shape the way we view the world. George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton try and bring broad ideas from sociology on what's called identity theory into economics. So what they were trying to argue is that a lot of what we do to justify the way we behave and what we value is to absorb particular identities. So if you think about becoming a parent, we might have the idea of what is the ideal parent. That's a kind of identity we think about and we conform to, and we behave in a context of a particular social norm around, say, parenting. That would be an example of an identity-based theory of what we value and what we like. Jean Tirole, who we just mentioned now, in some influential work with Roland Benabou, has worked a lot on how we do things to signal to others that we want to be part of social groups. So we might behave in particular ways because we seek approval of others and we want to get a reputation of a particular kind. And so they've approached the issue in that way. So there's work out there. Now, I want to interpret it, the preferences and values. So a word that economists, I think, have been very loath to use typically is the word culture. We've always thought that basically that's kind of belongs elsewhere. It doesn't belong in economics. And again, there will be many in economics who haven't thought that way, but by and large, I would say, certainly the way I was raised as an economist, discussions of culture were kept firmly at bay and thought of as somewhat distant from what we studied. And I'm going to think about preferences and values as part of culture. And they're not the only thing that's in culture. And you know, and under different views, you could put beliefs in there. You can put different things in what we think of as culture. But I want to think about preferences and values and their role. Now, where do they come from? Well, it may be that there's some genetic basis for preferences. I mean, after all, at the end of the day, there were certain basic things that humans needed to do to survive historically, which presumably were translated into the kind of preferences we have. So liking sweet foods is a famous example. Namely, if humans were not genetically selected to enjoy sweet food, in certain points in human history, we wouldn't have built up the reserves that we needed to survive in some difficult conditions. So there are some things that may have a genetic basis. But of course, if you think about preference, where we got a lot of our preferences or values from, they're from much more immediate social institutions, in particular the family, the social networks we mix in, the kinds of friends we make, and the kind of way we interact with them. And then education, as I say, I've mentioned that already, is a place from which we get a lot of our preferences and values that come from. And I'm going to appropriate a term which I quite liked when I first came across it, which is due to a sociologist, Bourdieu, which he called cultural capital, as a kind of catch-all for thinking about these variables and the way that the societies have them and the way they change over time. And it's really the dynamics of preference I'm going to end up focusing on this evening. So it's not so important for anything I'm going to say now, but I think it's important in the wider agenda that we might want to forge a distinction between what I'll call preferences and values. Preferences are a very narrow thing. They are the thing, the sort of the joy and that we get from consuming certain goods or taking certain actions, and they could be pecuniary or non-pecuniary gain. So I could like money because of what money allows me to do. But these are the kind of narrow standard definition of preference. Values, I think, are a slightly different concept, and they're about abstract ideals. Things that we want that are good for society are our values, which may or may not involve us doing things ourselves differently, although, again, I'll come to how we can think about that in terms of behavior in a moment. So I'm going to want to think of values as more about abstract ideals and preferences about the narrower gains and losses we get from the decisions we make in life. And when we think about value-driven behavior, and the reason I'm talking about this, by the way, is when one of the examples I want to develop for some of the ideas I'm talking about now is the dynamics of environmental preferences, and I think what I'm talking about now is particularly relevant to that. There are sort of two aspects of values. One is the way we behave, the decisions that we make. Do we recycle, or do we make investments in energy-saving technologies? These would be the decisions we make that might reflect our values about what we care about in terms of societal outcomes. And the others is the payoffs. Do we feel better about doing something? Maybe we do some things that make us feel miserable because that conforms to an ideal that we think we should pursue. It doesn't necessarily follow that we're happier when we pursue our values and our ideals. They can actually sometimes make us unhappy, but we still think it's important to do them. Now, Max Weber, in his writings, talks about actions as being wert rational or value rational, which he described as meaning beliefs, things that are driven by the value of something for its own sake, due to either ethical or aesthetic or religious behavior. And for those who know the psychology literature here, you'll recognize that this is rather similar to an idea that's sometimes called intrinsic motivation, that people do things because they think they're intrinsically worthwhile and important, not because they're trying to achieve some ulterior goal. And value-driven behavior is often described in terms of trying to do things for their own sake. And that was definitely Max Weber's view of the world. Let me just begin by pointing out something that I think it'll be entirely obvious to you, is that when you look at, and I'm just going to talk about cross-country evidence here, but you can disaggregate a lot more. You can look at regions within countries. You can look at, one area I've been looking at quite a lot recently is generational differences. What the young value, does that look any different from what the old value? Is there a life cycle? Do we change our values as we age, or do we have rather constant values? If we learn them when we're young, do they stay with us forever? There's lots of very interesting issues, but let me just look at this country by country. And there's a couple of, there's many different sources you can in principle look at values in terms of. And all I'm trying to do here is to suggest there are really tangible and observable things we can look at as part of this agenda. One is to look at a resource that's being increasingly used by economists called the World Values Survey, which was started by a sociologist called Engelhardt and has now become a sort of industry. And what it does is to ask people survey questions about what they believe in, whether it's questions about religion or questions about nationalism. A whole variety of things are asked of people to try and get at their values and their views. And that is now increasingly being used as a resource. And one thing you find is that, of course, people differ. That's hardly a surprise. People differ, though, in ways, though, that seem to be predictable at some level. Income and education and age, all for these different values, can have quite predictable effects. Armin Falk, who's a well-known economist, has been using the Gallup World Poll also to look at differences in preferences. And he looks at differences in risk preference, time preference, and positive and negative reciprocity, altruism, and trust across the world. And what we see when we look at the data are quite pronounced differences across societies. I say, I don't think you'll be tremendously surprised. So here's Falk's altruism map based on a question that he asks people around the world, or the Gallup World Survey, Gallup World Poll asks around and says, how much of if you had €1,000 windfall, and how much would you give to good causes without expecting anything in return? And he puts that on a scale and finds that people in different parts of the world have very different views about how much of a windfall they would decide to give to good causes. So there appears to be differences in altruistic preference we could call this a value or a preference, I don't really mind, but differences around the world. Now, for the point of view of something I'm going to do later, I also pulled out the following questions from the World Values Survey. These are slightly tricky to know how to interpret, so I'll put my hand up and say that up front, but it's going to be useful motivation for what I talk about later. And the World Values Survey asked people the question, should government reduce environmental pollution? And I've basically coded that as a 1 if they say they strongly agree or agree with the proposition that government should reduce environmental pollution. Now, of course, that may just vary because some places in the world are much more polluted than others. In other words, we all have the same preferences. We all want to live in unpolluted environments. But, if you happen to live in a place which is relatively clean, you say you strongly agree. And so it's arguably somewhat problematic, but you could, of course, attempt to control for that when you look at the answer. But the thing I want you to point out is you get very big differences from some populations where as few as 30% say they want to reduce environmental pollution through to populations where that's close to 1. And I can tell you when you control for the level of pollution using standard measures, you still find that people have apparently different views on this. Again, it's not surprising. And there's lots of evidence that if you do any survey data on people's environmental preferences, you do get heterogeneity of quite pronounced kind. Another is the answer to the question, should government increase tax to reduce pollution? And similarly, you'll get very big differences across countries. And this is all a way of motivating that we may just want to take these things as fixed, or we may want to think of these as things that we can think about how to study as economists. Now, outside of economics, the idea that values and preferences are socially constructed is just thought of as completely obvious. It's only economists who wouldn't necessarily have thought that. And here's a quote, actually, from a book I read recently by Bales, who is less well known, but Talcott Parsons, who's probably one of the most famous 20th century sociologists. And it's a book on the family and the sociology of the family. And there's this wonderful quote which says, if the essentials of human personality were determined biologically, independent of social systems, there'd be no need for families. It's because the human is not born but must be made through the socialization process that in the first instance families are necessary. They are factories which produce human personalities. We therefore suggest that the basic and irreducible functions of the family are 2. First, the primary socialization of children so that they can truly become members of the society into which they've been born. Second, the stabilization of the adult personalities of the society. So very clearly a view that we should not take people's values and preferences as given. These are created. So the question is, well, how are they created? Is it just some model of tradition, or can we say something more structured about the processes that might underpin that? Here's something from an economist. I also mentioned Sam Bowles as a pioneer. This was an article he published in the Journal of Economic Literature in 1998. And he's particularly talking about the role of institutions in influencing values and preferences. And he says the argument that economic institutions influence motivations and values is plausible. And the amount of evidence consistent with the hypothesis is impressive. And in fact, there's a lot of laboratory evidence that people have brought to bear. Many ethnographic and historical studies, for example, recount the impact of modern economic institutions on traditional or indigenous cultures. The rapid rise of feminist values, the reduction in family size, and the transformation of sexual practices coincide with the extension of women's labor force participation. Likewise suggests that changes in economic organization may foster dramatic changes in value orientations. So again, Sam's a card-carrying economist, perhaps a little bit on the, to forgive the pun, counterculture end of economics, but even so, it's not considered highly heretical for economists to think these things. So what am I going to do? I've kind of fairly long introduction, but I'm now going to speed up a bit. I want to explore frameworks for thinking about the interplay between values and preferences, politics, and policy dynamics. So I want to think of the way those three things interact. The key feature I'm going to get from a model is complementarities where cultural adaptation and policy change happen together. And I'm going to illustrate this primarily with an example from environmental policy, partly because I think this is a really interesting case. And it's a case where I think the future of mankind may well hinge on the success of a process by which policy dynamics can really influence values and preferences. If you take the kind of risks that we think human societies are running with man-made climate change, then we could really believe that potentially this is a very important issue. So I'll talk about that as my core example. And I'm going to talk about how politics responds to this. In particular, I'm going to think of a channel through which what people want is reflected in what they get through politics. That determines policy, and that creates a process. And then I'm going to think about what it tells us about debates about successful politics and the debates about political distortions and so forth and so on. I'm going to be very selective. I'm going to talk almost not at all about other research. In the written version of this, I will be suitably deferential, I hope, to all of the contributions on whose shoulders I stand, but that's not going to be what I'm going to spend time on today. And I'm going to, as I say, look at one very concrete example. So here's a sort of schematic picture of the kind of links I'm interested in. I'm interested in preferences and values, how they influence behavior, how political institutions play a role also along with them in influencing behavior, how that leads to policy outcomes, how that then generates payoffs, who does well, who does badly. But then the sort of slightly non-standard part is to worry about the dynamics of that via a process of socialization back on to the dynamics of preferences and values. And what are the tools we can use to think about that? This is part of a wider agenda of research that I'm engaged in, thinking about how organizations, policies, and institutions influence culture and are influenced by culture. And in particular, I'm working on the institution side quite a bit with my fellow traveler, Torsten Persson, with whom I've done quite a lot of work in the political economy area. Inside all of this is a little bit of a debate about responsive politics, which connects to some of the things which we've seen in newspapers recently. And that's the fact that one very naive view of modern democracy is that it's meant to be a responsive system. It's meant to respond to what people want. Now, I think that's a very naive reading of what democracy is all about, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time giving you what would be a very different lecture on my views about that. But I think it has a bearing on the process I'm going to talk about tonight, because we often complain when politics delivers things that citizens apparently want. And we talk about populism in the modern era, and recent events like Brexit in my own country or Trump mania in the US or whatever version you want to talk about, where people apparently influence what happens in politics, and politics becomes a reflection of at least what some people want. And the idea that majorities are decisive, of course, is not entirely hardwired into democracy. A lot of people think it is, but in fact, we spend a lot of time trying to build institutions that limit what majorities get. For example, the whole independence of the judiciary and having legal codes that operate outside of politics is about tempering what happens when we have majoritarian politics. Equally, we live in countries, many of which have independent central banks, whose job it is to make policy independent of the political process. So it's not a crazy idea that there would be attempts to curb majoritarianism. But lurking behind all of this is an interesting debate about what responsive politics delivers. And it's going to be particularly interesting when we worry about the dynamics of cultural change. Because there's a possibility that we don't just get short-lived consequences of what we get, but we can actually set in train processes by which things can evolve through a cultural dynamic that could have much longer-run consequences of particular elections and particular outcomes. I think I've already said this, so I won't dwell on it. Economists are generally suspicious of invoking cultural explanations. I'll say no more than that because I think I've already said it. Much less so outside of economics, and I think I've already more or less said that. I said I'm not going to talk much about the literature, and I'll be true to that. But I will talk a little bit about the evolving literature on the political economy of policy responsiveness. Because I've already mentioned that one view of politics is that it's about trying to engineer something closer somehow to what the majority of citizens want. And there are different models out there, different traditions within the political economy literature on whether or not that's a good, even predictive device for what actually emerges through representative democracies. The sort of cornerstone of the first generation political economy literature was something called the Downesian model, which was a model put together by Anthony Downs in a famous book on the economics of democracy, who argued that political parties were a bit like firms. And just as firms want to sell goods, so political parties want to get votes. And what political parties do to try and get votes is to try and position themselves as close as possible to the center ground and to what the majority of citizens want to give them the best possible chance of being elected. And that model, more or less, has been a kind of developed in different directions, has been sort of developed as a kind of cornerstone for how economists think about the process of democratic policy making. Now, it has lots of issues. It's way too simple. But I'm going to kind of take a little bit seriously the logic of that model as the cornerstone of the political economy model that I talk about today. Classic models of political economy are what we would call static. They tend to take as given the population and the outcome. Today I'm going to talk about a more dynamic model, but again, I don't want to review the literature in any detail. Now here's something I do want to dwell on just briefly, because this is less well-known material, particularly from the point of view of economists. And that's the economics or the models of social learning and socialization as applied to cultural change. And there's a bit of work now within economics. There's particularly influential work by Alberto Besley and Thierry Verdier, who have built strategic models in which parents bring up their children thinking about what kind of preferences they want their children to have, or what kind of values they think they want their kids to have. So applying a very economic-style model to thinking about the determination of values and preferences. And that work has, it's been quite influential. I've certainly been influenced by it in my thinking. The area, though, where I think really a light went on for me was much more reading the work of evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists. And in particular, this is work that's been around for 30 years. There's a very famous book on cultural evolution written by Rob Boyd and Richardson, which are based on using the tools of evolutionary biology to the determination of culture. And they tend to use models unlike economists, they don't tend to use models of strategic influence. It's not about people thinking, oh, I should try and influence my kids to behave in a particular way. They're much more models of unconscious social influence. So in the process of hanging out with your parents, you unconsciously acquired from them some amount of your values and preferences. Now, on occasions, and I'm a parent, I've done it, I gave lectures to my kids about what the right way to behave was. So there was no question or doubt I was trying to influence rather consciously their values and preferences. But a lot of the time, it's a much more subconscious process. For example, if they'd repeatedly seen me behaving in a way that was completely flatly contradictory from the way I was telling them to behave, then presumably I would have had much less influence than if they were just picking up unconscious cues from parental behavior. And indeed, among people who've studied developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology, they do find that this unconscious copying of parents is an incredibly important intergenerational dynamic. And this is much more where the cultural evolution literature comes from. Much more they think of there being, they sometimes use the term social learning, that the people are learning from others. It doesn't have to be your parents, it can be your peers, it can be networks that you engage in. You can join clubs and see how people behave. You know, I'm a football fan, you know, maybe I learn subconsciously from the behavior of other football fans. There are all sorts of ways we interact with others that can influence the way we behave. Now, in that literature, the literature that I'm particularly drawing on is a literature on what's called indirect evolution, which basically sees the product of this process being our values and preferences. So this is the kind of thing that I think only economists would really care about, but I don't want to think of the process acting independently on my behavior. I want to think of my behavior being really ultimately about what I care about. So economists typically model behavior as rooted in the preferences and values that we have, and then we follow a particular way of behaving because it conforms to our values and preferences. So the object that's changing and the object that's influenced is ultimately our preferences, and that's often known as the indirect evolutionary approach. And among well-known economists, Elinor Ostrom, who is a Nobel laureate, very much thought of that. She did a lot of work on collective action in small-scale societies, and the way she thought about what made collective action work was the internalization of values. So people became card-carrying members of a community and therefore cooperated with other people in that community because they'd internalized certain values. Okay? Let me mention one more thing, which I think then I can actually, for the remainder of my talk, I'll kind of get into some quite nitty-gritty, how do you actually do this in economics? What about welfare economics? Well, what is welfare economics? Welfare economics is the belief that economists can say something about why the world could be better or worse. And we have a framework, and to some degree, people buy into or don't buy into that framework. Now, one reason why economists have always been suspicious of allowing values and preferences to change is that somehow then you can't possibly do welfare analysis. So it could be true that if we take Britain in the 15th century, where people were not being, were being, treated much worse, maybe to some extent, by the state and by other individuals, maybe that was optimal for them because they didn't care less about being badly treated. So that we could take the view that, societies in the past or even other societies have different values and preferences from us, so why don't we just accept that there are these differences in values and preferences, and what's optimal for one society is different from what's optimal for another society. So because of people having different tastes. Now, this was brought home to me actually once, many, many years ago, getting on for 30 years ago, when I was at a conference which mixed up anthropologists and economists, and there was a debate about the laws that have been passed in India to stop what was called, for want of a better term, bride burning, sati, which was a process that when a woman was widowed and there was a funeral pyre, that the woman would be thrown onto the funeral pyre as a sacrifice, if you like. That was part of a social custom. And the state outlawed that social custom. But there was an anthropologist in the room who was arguing this was an entirely relativist judgment. That how could we, with our values and preferences, think this was a bad thing? If people within the communities that were practicing this had the values that they thought this was an appropriate way to treat women who had been widowed, it wasn't for us ever to question that social practice. Now, of course, you can imagine that became a very heated debate and discussion, but it sort of in a very stark way highlights the point I want to make, that are we then forced, in economics we've sort of thought that the best way to think about welfare is what people want. Are we forced to abandon that once we allow values and preferences to be different? And I will come back to that a little bit later. Now, of course, there are many very influential economists, Amartya Sen being perhaps one of the main, who long ago abandoned the idea that we should do welfare economics on the basis of what people want. And Amartya put forward an alternative approach, which he called the capabilities approach, as a way of thinking about what would be a good or bad society quite differently from what people necessarily want. But anyway, I want to put that on the table. Okay, now let me get into, someone going to tell me how long I've been going so I can budget my remaining time. This is a good economist, I'm maximizing under budget constraints here. Roughly how long do I have? You so do 25, okay, it's good. So I can get through a certain amount of this for the remainder of the talk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build three main building blocks. I'm going to talk about policy, I'm going to talk about politics, and then I'm going to talk about cultural adaptation. So here's a very simple way of thinking about it. There's a society that's living modulo human destruction by man-made global warming forever, let's say. So time is infinite and is labeled by T. And we're going to think of T as a generation here. Now, this is very simplistic because, of course, there are multiple generations alive at any point in time. But I think there's a bunch of generations, and the new generation is born and does overlap with the existing generation for purposes of socialization, but basically that's how the world evolves. There are two types in the population. I'm going to sketch what I think types are in a moment, but types are going to be in my main application, environmentalists and non-environmentalists. So this is really simple stuff, but I'm going to use this as a way of kind of giving a bit of precision to the kind of discussion that I think we have. And at each date, policies have to be chosen. And I'm just going to use an abstract idea of there being policies X that each generation has to choose, and that can be any policies you like, taxes, public spending, going to war, whatever it is that each society has to make decisions over. And there's going to be different types in the population, and at any date, there's going to be a fraction of the population, mu, that are type 1 people, and 1 minus mu are going to be type 0. And people are going to have, to use, in the standard way economists model this, they're going to have preferences that depend on their type. They're going to depend on policy, and they can also depend on how many of the other types there are in the population. So the decisions that people are made are sort of in this preference, in these preferences. These are what to use, those of you who are economists will know as an indirect utility function. So savings and labor supply and all them other things are subsumed in these preferences. There's going to be feasible policies, and the feasible policies could depend on the types in the population. So it may be that if you're going to tax environmental goods, the number of people who are spending on those goods, which could depend upon their types, are going to enter the feasible policies. And each type in the population is going to have some kind of preferred policies. So they're going to want something. So environmentalists may want one kind of policy, and non-environmentalists want a different kind of policy. And I'm going to model politics in a very simple way. I'm going to suppose, using the sort of Downsian paradigm I referred to earlier, that there are parties out there, and parties really only care about winning. So their job is to seek out things that give them the best chance of holding office. And again, very simple, but one could do things in a more complicated way. But for the purposes of what I want to talk about today, this suffices. And they're going to compete. How are they going to compete? They're going to offer alternatives. They're going to offer policies, and then people are going to vote between those policies, and then one of the parties is going to win, and then those are the policies that are going to happen in that period. Now, I'm going to use a very simple way of thinking about two kinds of voters. And actually, this is quite a powerful thing which comes out of the political science literature, particularly the Michigan election studies of the 1950s. They were some of the first quantitative studies of political behavior, and they've been replicated around the world. We have a version of it called the British Election Study, and I'm sure there's versions in other countries. What came out of the Michigan election studies as kind of a mantra was that there are two kinds of voters out there. There are voters who are strongly attached and have a very strong party loyalty, and then there are voters who basically switch around their votes, and they call them swing voters. And it turns out that if you look at any particular election, it's the swing voters where all the action is. So in Britain, you know, there are a bunch of people who've only ever voted Conservative, a bunch of people who only ever voted Labour, but the guys who really decide the election are the people who decide election by election which way they're going to go. Okay? And this was something that was observed by this political science research in the 1950s. And you can bring it into the kind of conceptual framework I'm talking about. You can think about what fraction of each type of voter is each type of preference type in the population are swing voters versus loyal voters. Are they going to vote for one party, whatever it offers, or are they going to swing depending on what's on offer? And one conjecture, so to give you an example of a phenomenon that this has been related to, it's whether older voters, so one thing that's been observed in Britain is that even through the period of austerity, old voters have done very well. In other words, they've had their pensions protected, even though there's been a lot of cuts in public spending. And one conjecture was, well, maybe this is because they're the swing voters, that no party can risk upsetting the older voter because the older voter is going to vote single-mindedly on what the best deal is. Now, there's an empirical question, is that the right view? But that would be an example where a particular group of voters are determined to get what they want and are basically willing to vote for whichever party is going to give them that. So we're going to say that a fraction gamma mu of voters are swing voters and a fraction 1 minus gamma 1 minus mu of type 0 are swing voters. Now, why am I belaboring this point? Well, if you think about what responsive politics is here now, responsive politics is really only responsive to people who are going to change their vote if you change your policy. So all of the action is going to come from studying how parties go after the swing voters. And basically, you can write down what's called in the political economy literature a probabilistic voting model, whereby the swing voters are going to decide which way to go, but they receive various popularity or information shocks. So, you know, maybe they like the look of one candidate, or they were particularly attracted by a particular commercial or whatever. There's some idiosyncratic factors that determine how people behave. And basically, you can put this, I'm not going to go through the detail because I imagine not many of you want to see it, but you can use this type of framework to think about how policies are going to be chosen by the different parties. And basically, you can solve the model, and what you find is that what really matters for the choice of policy for each party, and particularly the probability that each party wins, is going to be the way they provide an attractive platform to the swing voters. And that's what this thing in the middle of this middle equation is telling us. So the probability you win the election is how attractive you are to the swing voters relative to how attractive the other party is. And that's what this half plus Q thing in brackets is telling us. To cut a long story short, this allows us to think about the policies that are offered by parties. And the policies that are offered by parties are going to be particularly geared towards not the numerical, not the number of type 1 and type 0 guys in the population, but the fractions of them who are swing voters. And policy is going to move towards the preferences of type 1, as you'd expect if they're more numerous, but also if they're more represented among the swing voters. Okay? So when I come to the environmental example later, you'll see why this is an important thing to think about the nature of environmental policy and whether that tends to be the motive, the electoral motive is strong or weak. So basically you can ignore that. So what you get out of that is, and I'm going to use a term from population genetics here, you get the fitness of each type. What's the fitness of each type? The fitness of each type is how well that type does out of the electoral process. So in other words, if I'm a kind of person for whom politics tends to do what I want relative to what someone else wants, that makes my type fitter. I have a higher payoff from being that type. Okay? So in other words, so if you think about, sorry, just to kind of keep the analogy and say why I call this fitness, if you go back to population genetics, what kinds of populations tended to grow? Well, roughly speaking, it was the populations that tended to eat more and therefore could reproduce more. So essentially, fitness was determined by the amount that you ate, and that affected the number of mates you had, and therefore affected the process of propagation. What's the analogy for a cultural type? Well, those types that do very well in the world will tend to be more culturally attractive. If I look and I say people who behave in a particular way, on average do better than people who behave in a different way, that's the comparative idea of fitness in a cultural setting. Now, politics can make some types fitter than others. Why? Because politics can consistently do better for certain kinds of people. So if I'm a radical racist, and it turns out that the political process always does the things that racists want, that's going to increase the fitness of that type, because that type is going to get more of what they want. And if there's a cultural dynamic, that's going to be attractive to that type propagating in the population. So there's a process by which politics, culture, and policy sort of interact in this kind of framework. Okay, how does cultural adaptation work? Well, we tell a story in a lot of the work I've done, basically by parents inculcating values in children which are influenced by the fitness of different types in the population. So if you are deciding what kind of, how you're going to bring up your kids, you'll tend to want to bring up kids to be the successful type in the population. And you can write down a formal structure using the very simple tools, and I'm unfortunately not going to have time to go into the detail of that structure, which allows you to study the cultural dynamics in a way that gives you something which is like the kinds of equations that come out of population genetics for the dynamics of types in the population. Okay, and what you get, and I'm going to just get to it straight away, is simple equations like this, which are equations for the dynamics of the population type that are related back to the assortativeness of the mating process in the population. So do people of similar cultural types tend to mix and mate only with people of other similar cultural types, or is there more cultural diversity? That's going to be important, because in populations with very little cultural diversity, there's very little cultural change. There's more cultural change relative to populations where you tend to only mix with people like yourself. And more importantly, the relative fitness of the types in the population. So this kind of equation is what comes out of this basic dynamical process that I've described. Okay? So I know I've gone over this way quicker, and for those of you who are interested, I hope you'll read the paper that I'm writing so that you can see how this works in sort of the kind of pace at which you could understand the way the pieces work together. But what I've tried to do is to write down a framework in which policy co-evolves with preferences, elections shape the outcome, give an advantage or disadvantage to certain types in the population, and that gives rise to cultural dynamics. Okay, so for the last few minutes I have, I want to think about how this applies to one very specific policy area, which is the area of environmentalism. I think it's an interesting area because policy and attitudinal differences vary massively across countries. They may vary massively across age and other characteristics, education also. We see a lot of diversity in terms of this value in the population. So it's something we should be thinking about. Where does that diversity come from? Across countries or within generations or wherever it might come from. So and it's fairly straightforward to apply the basic framework I've laid out to this example. it turns out there's also a huge literature in psychology and ecology studying environmental values, the differences in populations. And I sort of agree with this proposition that the kind of human impact on the environment may depend on the kinds of environmental policies we put in place. So we can put in taxes on fuel to try and discourage people from driving as much as they would, or we can put taxes on pollutants to try and reduce the levels of pollutants. But in the end, changes in values are an important route to more sustainable behavior and policy. And this is really something that's quite ingrained in the literature on this outside of economics, not so much inside of economics. That if you're going to change populations, you should really change what people want, rather than just trying to tinker around the edges and put a few cents on the petrol here or put a few cents on this or that. Of course, there are areas where we've made a massive difference. So some of the standards that have been employed on energy efficiency of appliances have made massive differences to these things. So it's not like policy is unable to act. But of course, one of the things you hear a great deal of from politicians is there's huge political resistance to going further than we have. Why don't we do more? Why don't we mandate that people should insulate their homes? Well, we don't mandate it because the politicians say we'd never win an election if we mandated it. So there is this notion that the constraint ultimately is what people want, and therefore that we can't go further as a consequence of that. Now, when people have studied values in this area, they basically have two dimensions of the two I mentioned above. Behaviors, do you recycle? Why do you recycle? On the whole, recycling is incredibly inconvenient. It's much easier to just throw everything in the trash and then put it out in a bag and someone collects it. It's an inconvenient thing to do, but a lot of people do it because they think it's the right thing to do. If you ask people, why do you recycle? It's mostly because they think that's what they should be doing as opposed to what they're being forced to do. Indeed, in Britain, and I don't know what's true in Spain, there's almost no enforcement. I mean, we all get given recycling bins, but there's no serious effort to check whether people are complying, are putting recyclables in recycling bins or just putting them in the trash. Another area is political activism. There are a lot of people who are politically active in trying to influence things. So universities are a very interesting case at the moment. There's been big changes in energy efficiency use in some, because of movements by faculty members and students to try and get universities to be more ecologically sound and to think about their energy consumption and to think about these goals. And there's various debates about where does this come from. Is it self-interest? I mean, one view is it's all about worrying about my long distance in the future relatives who are just, I'm really caring out in a rather self-interested way because I care. So there's a sort of biological theory of self-interest. We just care about our future family members and it's all, but I don't think most people think that's the most credible view of why we engage in these behaviors. There's sort of two different kinds of altruism. People talk about humanistic altruism. We care about the future of the human race because we think that's an important value. Or it could be biospheric altruism. We just care about, the extinction of species and other things. There are lots of different views about what values ultimately are about. But anyway, the literature here, I think, is a very good case where the kind of frame. Now, I'm not going to go I'll disappoint some of you and I'll please most of you, I imagine, by not going through the detail of this. But I want to put this diagram up, which will be very hard to understand without having gone through anything. But I'll do my best to talk about this. Now, think of the dynamics of environmentalism is kind of interesting. How much environmental policy will we get? Well, we'll get environmental policy proportionate to the number of environmentalists in the population, the people who really care that government should be doing more, and will vote on the basis of that belief. So that's where the swing voter part comes in. How many people would literally be willing to switch their vote on the basis of a policy, a better environmental policy being adopted by a particular party? That's going to determine how responsive the political system is to environmentalism, at least in a very crude responsive politics model. And that's going to affect how well environmentalists do relative to non-environmentalists in terms of the kinds of policies that they get. So if I get very upset about other people polluting the planet, and I bring my kids up to be very upset about everyone else polluting the planet, that's not a very fit, to use the genetic term, set of preferences to endow my kids with, because they'll just be miserable if everyone's polluting the planet and they're just upset about it the whole time. So if I care at all about my kids being happy rather than just frustrated, it may encourage me to say, oh, well, forget it, to hell with it. I'll just, polluting the planet's fine, because you're just going to be unhappy if you brought up with those views. Now, of course, I'm painting it in a very stark and slightly crazy way that maybe only economists could, but the bottom line is that process will generate a dynamic. And there's, in the model that I write down, that dynamic can be happy or unhappy in terms of what ultimately happens to environmentalists in the world. Environmentalists could be having a very unhappy time. They are to the to the left of that mu hat, which is this little critical level of environmentalism. To the left of this line, environmentalists are on the whole miserable. They're losing out. And over time, their fitness in the population, therefore, is very low. Now, there may be things that keep them going, that, circulating, videos of furry animals or whatever it is that keeps people going that would make them feel that they should still persevere in their beliefs. But in the most stark version of the model, environmentalism doesn't take off. Indeed, it declines over time. And, if you think that ultimately this is mutually guaranteed human destruction, this is where the world ultimately means we all end up polluting the planet so much that the human race doesn't survive. And then there's a happier trajectory for the human race, which is to the right of mu hat, where environmentalists get a toehold in the political process. They start to pass the policies that actually are good for environmentalists and make them actually happier. We actually grow the stock of environmentalism until we all come back if we could, in 300 years or 200 years, although actually we've probably already faced cap T by then, and everybody cares about the environment because they've all realized that this is the right thing to do. We get on top of the problem, the human race survives, and this is the dominant political force in society. Now, of course, this is a very simple model, but I think it serves to illustrate this dynamic process and how it can lead policy down these two different routes. Now, could we ever get there with responsive politics? Well, let me end up, this is the final thing I want to say. Am I getting close? I'm looking to my minders here. How close to the end am I getting? Oh, great, 3 minutes. 3 minutes will get me here. Okay, could we ever get there with the kind of responsive politics we have now? And this is where I come to this sort of naive view. I don't think democracy and successful societies are ultimately about majoritarian outcomes. Majoritarianism does not equal democracy. Democracy is about other things, the rule of law, checks and balances, independent judiciary. It's about lots of things, and it's about human rights. Are we going to need non-majoritarian policies, I think, to lead us towards a better outcome, a better dynamic on things like the big challenges like climate change? These things are set up to limit electoral influence. They are consciously set up in many cases. Independent central banks are consciously set up to do this. Well, there's one area where I think, sorry, I'm skipping over the equations here. Actually, I wanted to go back to this. Where is it? I've got it here somewhere. There's one area which I did want to do, not least because of where I come from. Oh, I've lost it. Apologies for that. Okay, well, I'll just say it out loud rather than having to see it on a slide. There's one area of non-majoritarian policy where, I'll get to my slide and then I'll talk about it. There's one area of non-majoritarian policy where the European Union has been particularly important, and that is the area of environmentalism. And I can come here as a country that's just voted to leave the European Union and say this with my hand on my heart. Ever since the Paris meeting of 1972, the European Union actually has been at the forefront of environmental policy. But of course, we always criticize the European Union for not being a majoritarian institution, for being remote from what citizens want. Now, what's the right interpretation of that? The right interpretation of that is that there are circumstances in which we think policy needs to lead public opinion. We need to start putting in place the kinds of policies we need to convince people to change the way they're going to behave ahead of the political process. And the European Union's remoteness, which is often the thing we criticize it most for, indeed was probably one of the reasons why we have Brexit, is actually a virtue in areas of policy where it can get through changes that wouldn't be acceptable changes to the majorities of the many countries that participate. And I'd say on environmental policy, it's almost because we haven't got majoritarian policy in Europe that we've been able to achieve a lot. It's not just that. It's also that many environmental externalities are much more than country-specific. They are about the whole area of Europe. So in the end, this could be an area, and my mind is now looking anxious that I need to wrap up, that, sorry, I did have it on this slide, that we think that there's an important role for the non-majoritarian institutions in leading value and preference change. And that brings me to my final slide. What I've tried to do in this lecture is to open up the black box and to get us thinking about values and preferences and politics and the interplay between those. And there are many challenges and there are many ways in which I think we need to develop this framework. But I've kind of become convinced that these are not topics that are off limit to economics, and we can bring them into our analysis of simple economic models so that we can teach them to our students and to our undergrads and to other people who are studying economics. But not only that, I think we can start to get into debates and discussions which we would otherwise be exiled from if we don't take these ideas seriously. So thank you very much.